I need to clarify something about the premise you've provided. The detailed premise about Jimmy Nakamura and his Springfield rifle at Peleliu is actually a combat story, not a POW, prisoner of war story. However, your instructions clearly ask for a POW story with themes of captivity, moral contradiction, and encounters with enemy humanity. I'll create a POW story that follows your detailed universe guidelines, while using the Springfield rifle as the symbolic artifact. Here's the story. The museum piece. The train wheels ground against the tracks with a rhythm that seemed to mock time itself. Private first class. Jimmy Nakamura pressed his face against the cold window of the freight car, watching the German countryside roll past in the grey December light of 1944. Snow dusted the fields, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang with a sound that reminded him painfully of Sunday mornings in Oregon. The rifle looked like something a farmer might use to scare crows from his cornfield. Even now, stripped of ammunition and confiscated by his captors, the Springfield 1903 lay among the pile of personal effects being transported with the American prisoners. Jimmy could see its worn wooden stock and pitted barrel through the mesh of the cargo net, and the sight of it brought back memories of that morning on Peleliu when Corporal Peterson had called it a relic. "Where'd you even find that antique, Nakamura?" Peterson had laughed, not knowing that in 3 hours he'd be face down in the corral and Jimmy would be the only one left from their foxhole. Now, 6 months later, and a world away from the Pacific, Jimmy understood the bitter irony. The rifle that had saved Charlie Company on Bloody Nose Ridge was just another trophy for the Wehrmacht, proof of American prisoners taken during the failed Ardennes counteroffensive. The museum piece had outlasted most of the Marines who'd mocked it. The train shuddered to a halt at a small station whose sign read, "Meiningen." Guards in field grey uniforms slid open the doors, and cold air rushed in with the scent of pine and coal smoke. Jimmy caught a glimpse of the town beyond the platform. Neat houses with steep roofs, children walking to school with books under their arms, women carrying market baskets. It looked disturbingly normal, like any small American town preparing for Christmas. "Raus, schnell!" the guards shouted, but not unkindly. These weren't SS troops or concentration camp guards. They were Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them older men with the tired faces of fathers and grandfathers. One guard, a sergeant with greying temples, helped an injured American private down from the car with surprising gentleness. The camp sat in a valley surrounded by forested hills, its wooden barracks and watchtowers looking almost quaint under their caps of snow. A sign by the gate read, "Stalag 7 Amusberg," but what struck Jimmy most was the smell. Bread baking somewhere beyond the wire, mixed with wood smoke and the clean scent of winter air. It wasn't the smell of suffering he'd expected. As they were processed through the main gate, Jimmy noticed something that made him pause. A German guard was sharing his lunch with a group of French prisoners, breaking his black bread into pieces and passing it around while they talked in a mixture of broken German and French. The guard was laughing at something one of the Frenchmen had said. Back home in Oregon, Jimmy had been taught that Germans were fanatics, that they fought without mercy or human feeling. But this guard looked like Mr. Hoffman, who ran the hardware store in Bend, the same round face and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "First time?" asked a British sergeant who'd been watching Jimmy's expression. The man's name tag read Davies, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd been in the camp for years. "Yes, sir," Jimmy replied. "You'll find it's not quite what they told you it would be," Davies said quietly. "Nothing about this war is what they told us it would be." That night, lying on a straw mattress in Barracks 12, Jimmy stared at the ceiling and thought about the Springfield rifle locked away in some German warehouse. Sergeant Morrison's words echoed in his memory. "In war, it's about understanding your tool, knowing your enemy, and making every shot count." "Boo! But what happened when you discovered your enemy wasn't who you thought he was?" If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How do you prepare to hate people who hand you bread? The morning roll call took place in the central yard at say 600 hours, with prisoners arranged by nationality, Americans in one section, British in another, French, Polish, and Russians each in their designated areas. The German guards moved efficiently through their count, clipboards in hand, breath visible in the cold air. Jimmy learned the routine quickly. After roll call came work assignments. Some men were detailed to the camp kitchen, others to maintenance or the small factory outside the wire where they manufactured wooden crates for the Wehrmacht. The work was tedious but not brutal, and the guards enforced the Geneva Convention regulations about prisoner treatment with Germanic precision. What surprised Jimmy was the level of organization among the prisoners themselves. The senior American officer, Colonel Matthews, had established a camp university where prisoners taught each other languages, mathematics, history, and engineering. British airmen shared their knowledge of navigation and meteorology. French resistance fighters taught woodworking and mechanical skills. "The war won't last forever," Davies explained as he showed Jimmy around the camp's makeshift library. "When we get home, we need to be men worth coming home to." In the corner of the library, Jimmy discovered something unexpected, a collection of German books donated by the guards. Poetry by Goethe and Heine, philosophy by Kant, novels by Thomas Mann. One guard, Unteroffizier Weber, spent his off-duty hours helping prisoners learn German grammar, patiently correcting pronunciation and explaining idioms. Weber was a schoolteacher from Bavaria who'd been drafted at age 45. He had 3 sons, one serving on the Eastern Front, one in North Africa, and one who'd been killed at Normandy. Weber carried their photographs in his wallet and showed them to anyone who asked, speaking of them with the universal pride of a father, regardless of nationality. "This is Klaus," he told Jimmy one afternoon, pointing to a picture of a young man in a Luftwaffe uniform. He wanted to be an engineer before the war. He designed bridges. Jimmy found himself thinking of his own father, who'd built bridges for the Oregon Department of Transportation. The parallel was unsettling. Another crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed about the enemy. The camp's daily rhythm was punctuated by unexpected moments of humanity. When Private Morrison collapsed during a particularly cold morning roll call, it was a German guard who carried him to the infirmary. When the Red Cross packages arrived irregularly, the camp commandant, Oberst Brenner, distributed his own rations to supplement what the prisoners received. Brenner was a career officer from the old Prussian tradition, formal and correct, but not without compassion. He'd been wounded in the First War and walked with a slight limp that became more pronounced in cold weather. During camp inspections, he addressed the senior Allied officers as equals, discussing conditions and concerns with military courtesy. "The Obersts lost 2 brothers in this war," Davies told Jimmy. "But he still treats us better than some of our own officers treated us back home." That evening, as Jimmy wrote his first letter home, he struggled with what to tell his family. How could he explain that his guards shared their food, that German soldiers sang Christmas carols in the evening, that the enemy had human faces and worried about their own loved ones? Outside his window, Weber was teaching a group of British prisoners to sing Silent Night in German. Their voices harmonized in the cold air, the same melody Jimmy had known since childhood, but in the language of the enemy. The beautiful familiarity of it made something ache in his chest. He thought of the Springfield rifle again, wondering if understanding your enemy was supposed to make everything harder, not easier. The first letter from home arrived on a Tuesday in January 1945, 3 weeks after Jimmy had written to his family. The paper was thin and had traveled thousands of miles, but it still smelled faintly of his mother's lavender soap. She wrote about the Victory Garden, about his father working double shifts at the lumber mill, about the gold star that now hung in the Hendersons' window next door. "Everyone here is so proud of what you boys are doing over there," she wrote. "Mr. Peterson at the hardware store says you're showing those Germans what American fighting spirit means. He says they're all fanatics who need to be taught a lesson. We pray every night that you're giving them what they deserve." Jimmy folded the letter carefully and placed it in his footlocker next to the notebook where he'd been recording his daily observations. The contradiction between his mother's words and his daily reality created a weight in his chest that seemed to grow heavier each day. That afternoon, Weber approached him during the German language lesson. "You seem troubled today, Jimmy," Weber said in careful English. "Bad news from home?" "No, sir, just catching up." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "It is difficult, yes, when the world you left behind does not match the world you have found." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the yard. A new transport had arrived, a group of American airmen shot down during the recent bombing raids on Dresden. They were young, most barely 20, and they brought news that made the entire camp go quiet. "They're saying the Russians are only 100 miles east of here," one of the airmen told Colonel Matthews during the evening briefing. "And the British are pushing up from the south. Word is, this whole war might be over by summer. The prospect of liberation should have brought joy." But Jimmy noticed something troubling in the faces around him. Many of the prisoners had been here for years. They'd built lives, friendships, routines. They'd learned to see their guards as individuals rather than enemies. Some had even begun to care about what happened to Weber's sons, or whether Oberst Brenner's arthritis was bothering him in the cold weather. "What happens to them when we leave?" Davies asked quietly. "When the Russians get here, what happens to Weber? To the Oberst?" It was a question none of them could answer, but it hung over the camp like smoke from the kitchen chimneys. During the evening meal, Jimmy noticed that conversations were more subdued, glances between prisoners and guards more weighted with unspoken concerns. After lights out, Jimmy lay in his bunk, thinking about the Springfield rifle again. He remembered Sergeant Morrison's words about understanding your enemy. But Morrison had meant understanding their tactics, their weaknesses, their patterns of movement. He hadn't meant understanding their humanity, their fears, their love for their families. Weber had shown him photographs of his classroom back in Bavaria, 28 children learning mathematics and literature. Weber worried about them constantly, wondering who was teaching them now, whether they were getting enough to eat, whether the war would end before they were old enough to be drafted. "How does this work?" Jimmy whispered to Davies across the narrow space between their bunks. "How do we go home and explain that the enemy wasn't who we thought they were?" "Maybe that's not our job to explain," Davies replied. "Maybe that's something each man has to figure out for himself. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What do you owe to the truth you've lived versus the truth you're expected to remember? February brought news of the Allied advance, and with it a subtle but unmistakable change in the camp's atmosphere. The guards became more nervous, more careful about regulations. Oberst Brenner held daily conferences with his staff, and Jimmy could see the strain in the older man's face. Weber still conducted the German lessons, but his mind seemed elsewhere. During one session, he stopped mid-sentence while explaining verb conjugations and stared out the window for several minutes. "Herr Weber?" one of the British prisoners asked gently. "Forgive me," Weber said, returning his attention to the lesson. "I received word yesterday that my eldest son is missing near Berlin." He paused, his voice carefully controlled. "The mail is very slow these days." Jimmy felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he couldn't quite name. Weber had become more than a guard. He was a teacher, a father worried about his children, a man who'd shared stories about his classroom and his students' dreams for the future. That evening, Jimmy found Weber sitting alone in the small office where he prepared his lessons. The older man was writing a letter by lamplight, and Jimmy could see his hands trembling slightly. "Is there anything I can do to help, sir?" Jimmy asked from the doorway. Weber looked up, surprised. "That is very kind, Jimmy, but I think not." He gestured to the letter. "I am writing to my wife, trying to find words that will give her hope when I have so little myself." Jimmy remembered his grandfather's letters from France, how carefully they'd been composed to protect his grandmother from the worst truths of war. "My grandfather always said the hardest part of war wasn't what you had to do, it was what you had to keep to yourself." "Your grandfather was a wise man," Weber replied. "What did he fight in?" "The Argonne Forest, 1918. He used to say that wars end, but the carrying never does." Weber nodded slowly. "Perhaps after this war ends, men like your grandfather and men like me will be able to speak honestly about the carrying. Perhaps our grandchildren will understand what we could not say to our wives and children." The next morning brought troubling news. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, a low rumble that made the windows rattle. Colonel Matthews called a meeting of senior prisoners to discuss evacuation procedures, while Oberst Brenner met with his guards about the same issue. During the lunch break, Jimmy witnessed something that would stay with him for years. A young German guard, barely 18, and clearly terrified of the approaching Russians, dropped his rifle and began crying. Without hesitation, Davies and 2 other British prisoners formed a protective circle around the boy, shielding him from view while he composed himself. "It's all right, lad," Davies said softly in German. "We've all been scared. That's not something to be ashamed of." The guard nodded gratefully, wiped his eyes, and picked up his rifle. He never forgot that moment of kindness from men who were technically his enemies. That afternoon, Weber pulled Jimmy aside. "There is something I want to give you," he said, leading Jimmy to his quarters. From a footlocker under his bunk, he withdrew a small leather journal. "This contains addresses of teachers across Germany who will need help rebuilding schools after the war. If you survive this, if you come back as an occupation soldier or as a civilian, perhaps you will remember that we are not all the same." Jimmy accepted the journal, feeling its weight. "What about your rifle, sir? The Springfield?" Weber looked surprised. "You know about this? I've been wondering what happened to it. It is locked in the commandant's office with other confiscated items. Why do you ask?" Jimmy struggled to explain. "It's hard to say, sir. That rifle, it meant something to me. It was proof that sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. That sometimes what others laugh at turns out to be exactly what you need." Weber studied Jimmy's face carefully. "I think I understand. Come with me." They walked to Oberst Brenner's office, where Weber spoke quietly with the commandant in rapid German. After several minutes of discussion, Brenner nodded and unlocked a storage cabinet. He withdrew the Springfield, checking the action and examining the custom trigger work. "This is well made," the Oberst said in careful English. "Very precise. You did this modification yourself?" "Yes, sir. My father was a gunsmith in Dresden," Brenner said, running his fingers along the stock. "He would have appreciated such careful work. Weber has told me this rifle has significance for you beyond its military value." "Yes, sir, it does." Brenner considered this, then made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "When this war ends, when the chaos settles, this rifle should return to you. It is not a weapon now. It is a memory. And memories, I think, may be more important than weapons in the years to come." The secret came to light on a cold morning in March, when Jimmy was assigned to help sort through Red Cross packages in the commandant's office. While organizing medical supplies, he discovered a hidden cache of documents that Oberst Brenner had been keeping in a locked drawer. The papers were correspondence between the camp and higher command, dating back 2 years. Jimmy's limited German was enough to understand the basic content, repeated requests from SS administrative offices to transfer Jewish prisoners to other facilities, and Brenner's careful bureaucratic responses explaining why such transfers were logistically impossible or temporarily delayed due to transport difficulties. Weber found Jimmy staring at the papers 20 minutes later. "You should not be reading those," Weber said quietly, but without anger. "He's been protecting them, hasn't he?" Jimmy asked. "The Jewish prisoners. He's been keeping them here instead of sending them elsewhere." Weber was quiet for a long moment. "There are things about this war that even we do not speak of, Jimmy. Things that make men choose between following orders and remaining human beings." "How many has he saved?" 43 men since 1943, Weber replied. "Russian Jews, Polish Jews, a few French. They are listed in our records as mechanics and interpreters. Skilled workers too valuable to transfer." Jimmy thought of the rifle again, how Sergeant Morrison had talked about understanding your tools and your enemy. But what Morrison hadn't mentioned was what happened when you discovered your enemy was more decent than your own propaganda had led you to believe. "What will happen to him when the war ends?" Jimmy asked. "I do not know," Weber admitted. "The Russians, they may not ask many questions about paperwork. But the Americans, when they investigate, they may see only a German officer and a prison camp. They may not look closely enough to see the 43 men who are alive because he chose to lose their transfer orders." That afternoon, Jimmy made a decision that would haunt him for years. He approached Colonel Matthews with the documents, explaining what he'd found and what it meant. The colonel studied the papers for a long time before speaking. "This puts us in a difficult position, Private. Officially, we can't seem to be collaborating with the enemy command. Unofficially, well, 43 lives is 43 lives. What do we do, sir?" "We make sure this information reaches the right people when the time comes," Matthews said. "We make sure that when they evaluate Oberst Brenner's service record, they understand the full picture." That evening, Weber approached Jimmy during the German lesson with something wrapped in oiled cloth. "The Oberst has asked me to give this to you," Weber said. Jimmy unwrapped the package to find the Springfield rifle, completely restored. The stock had been re-oiled, the metal cleaned and preserved. Attached was a small note in careful English. "A tool should return to the craftsman who understands it. O. Brenner." "I don't understand," Jimmy said. "Why now?" "Because tomorrow we begin evacuating the camp," Weber replied. "The Russians will be here within days. The Oberst wants to ensure that certain things reach the right hands before that happens." Jimmy held the rifle, feeling its familiar weight. The weapon that had once been mocked as a museum piece, that had saved lives on Peleliu, that had been confiscated as a trophy of war, was now being returned as a gesture of respect between enemies who had learned to see each other's humanity. "Will I see you again after this?" Jimmy asked. Weber shrugged. "Who can say? Wars end, but the world that comes after, that is always a mystery." He paused, then added, "But I think that rifle will remind you that not all of us were what your newspapers said we were. And perhaps that is enough." That night, Jimmy wrote in his journal, "Today I learned that the hardest enemy to fight is the one who turns out to be a decent man." How do you explain to people back home that sometimes the enemy's kindness is more dangerous to your certainties than their cruelty? The evacuation began at dawn on March 15, 1945. Soviet artillery had moved within 10 miles of the camp, and the sound of tank engines could be heard rumbling through the forests to the east. The prisoners formed ranks in the central yard, while German guards prepared to march them west toward American lines. Oberst Brenner addressed the assembled men in both English and German, his voice carrying across the yard with military precision. "Gentlemen," he began, "this war is ending. In the confusion that follows, some things will be remembered and others forgotten. I hope that you will remember that honor can exist even between enemies, and that a man's uniform does not always reflect his heart." Jimmy shouldered his pack, the Springfield rifle secured across his back. Around him, American, British, and French prisoners said goodbye to German guards who had become, in some strange way, friends. Davies shook hands with Weber, exchanging addresses and promises to write. Other prisoners shared their remaining cigarettes and chocolate with guards who had no idea what would happen to them when the Russians arrived. Weber found Jimmy at the gate as the column prepared to move out. "I have something else for you," Weber said, pressing a small wrapped package into Jimmy's hands. "Letters from my students in Bavaria. They wrote to their teacher about their hopes for after the war. Perhaps someday you will visit that classroom and see that German children dream of the same things American children dream of. The march west took 3 days through a countryside in chaos. Refugees filled the roads, fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. German soldiers threw away their weapons and tried to blend in with civilian populations. In the confusion, the line between prisoner and guard became increasingly meaningless. On the second day, when they encountered an American patrol from Patton's Third Army, the moment Jimmy had dreamed of for months felt strangely hollow. The young lieutenant who processed their liberation looked at the mixed group of Allied prisoners and German guards with confusion. "Which ones are ours?" he asked Colonel Matthews. "All of them in a way," Matthews replied quietly. Weber and 3 other guards were immediately separated and marched away for interrogation. Jimmy never saw him again, though he learned years later that Weber had been released in 1947 and returned to his classroom in Bavaria. The homecoming to Oregon in August 1945 was everything Jimmy's family had imagined. Parades, speeches about American valor, celebration of victory over fascism. But Jimmy found himself unable to fully participate in the joy. When people asked about his experiences, he gave the answers they expected. Stories of hardship, endurance, and waiting for liberation. He never mentioned Weber's German lessons, or Oberst Brenner's hidden documents, or the morning when a teenage guard cried and British prisoners comforted him. Those memories belonged to a more complicated story than anyone wanted to hear. The Springfield rifle was mounted above his fireplace, and sometimes visitors would ask about it. Jimmy would tell them it was a family heirloom that had served him well in the war. He never mentioned that it had been returned to him by an enemy officer as an act of respect and reconciliation. In 1995, 50 years after his liberation, Jimmy received a letter from Bavaria. It was written in careful English by a woman named Anna Weber, daughter of Unteroffizier Weber. She was now a teacher herself, working to establish exchange programs between German and American schools. "My father spoke of you often before he died," she wrote. "He kept your letters, the ones you sent after the war. He said you understood that enemies could choose to remain human, and that this understanding was the only thing that made peace possible. He wanted you to know that his classroom is still there, still teaching children to build bridges instead of walls." Jimmy sat in his study, holding the letter and looking at the Springfield rifle on the wall. At 73, he finally understood what his grandfather had meant about the carrying. Some truths were too complex for victory parades, too nuanced for newspaper headlines, too human for simple categories of good and evil. He began writing his reply to Anna Weber, and for the first time in 50 years, he wrote honestly about the German guards who had shown him that humanity could exist even in war, that understanding your enemy didn't make you a traitor. It made you a witness to something larger than the conflict itself. The rifle had taught him that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. The war had taught him that sometimes the hardest truth to carry was the knowledge that your enemy was also a human being, worthy of the same dignity and respect you hope to receive yourself. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What would you choose to remember, and what would you choose to carry in silence?